Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing family secrets ever buried in the Kentucky mountains. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will shake your understanding of ancestral loyalty and the darkness that can fester across generations in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that haunted 3 generations of one isolated family, where blood ties became chains of silence, and tradition transformed into something unspeakable. In the remote hollows of Harlan County, Kentucky, the Greer family defied all rational understanding and left a legacy so horrifying that for decades, local authorities actively suppressed the records, choosing to let the mountains keep their secrets. It was the year 1947. The world was rebuilding from the devastation of World War II. Soldiers were returning home to embrace modernity and progress, and America was on the cusp of unprecedented prosperity. But in the depths of Appalachia, in those forgotten corners where the light of the 20th century barely penetrated, time moved differently. Here, old ways persisted, ancient beliefs held firm, and some families guarded traditions that should never have survived into the modern age. The Kentucky mountains are not merely geographic features. They are living barriers, walls of stone and forest that have, for centuries, isolated communities from the outside world. In places like Harlan County, settlements existed in such profound seclusion that neighboring communities might as well have been foreign countries. These were not charming rural villages connected by paved roads and telephone lines. These were clusters of wooden cabins accessible only by treacherous footpaths, where families lived as their great-grandparents had lived, suspicious of outsiders, faithful to bloodlines, governed by laws that predated the Constitution. In one such hollow, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense laurel thickets and across a creek that swelled to impassable fury with every rain, stood the Greer homestead. The main structure was a log cabin built sometime in the 1870s, its wood blackened by decades of coal smoke, its windows small and deep, set like watchful eyes. Around it clustered smaller buildings, a smokehouse, a root cellar dug into the hillside, a barn that leaned precariously to one side, and further back, barely visible through the trees, a stone structure that locals would later describe with visible unease. The Greer family had lived in this hollow for 4 generations by 1947. They were known to the few who knew them at all as intensely private, self-sufficient to the point of paranoia, and bound by family loyalty so absolute it seemed almost religious. They rarely came to town, they traded little. They married among themselves or brought spouses from equally isolated families in distant hollows. And they had, over the decades, developed a reputation that people spoke of only in whispers, if they spoke of it at all. Because there were things about the Greers that didn't make sense, inconsistencies that troubled the few who noticed them, questions that went unanswered. To understand what happened in that hollow, you must first understand the mountains themselves and the peculiar culture they bred. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient beyond human comprehension. When dinosaurs walked the earth, these peaks were already old, already worn down from heights that once rivaled the Himalayas. By the time European settlers arrived, the mountains had been shaped by hundreds of millions of years of erosion into a labyrinth of ridges and hollows, each valley a world unto itself, separated from the next by steep, forested slopes that could take hours to traverse. The people who settled here in the late 1700s and early 1800s were themselves shaped by isolation. Many were Irish, carrying with them Celtic traditions and a clan-based understanding of family loyalty. Others were English, German, or Cherokee, and in the mountains, these cultures blended and mutated into something unique. They developed their own dialect, preserving Elizabethan English phrases that had vanished elsewhere. They maintained folkways herbalism, water witching, faith healing, that elsewhere would be dismissed as superstition. And they lived by codes of honor and obligation that, in extreme cases, could justify actions that the outside world would find incomprehensible. Blood loyalty was everything. Family came first, second, and third. Disputes with outsiders were settled within the family. Crimes against family members demanded retribution, swift and severe. And family secrets, no matter how dark, were guarded with a ferocity that outsiders could never penetrate. This was the world in which the Greer family existed. The patriarch in 1947 was Ezekiel Greer, 70, 3 years old. A man whose face looked like it had been carved from the same weathered stone as the mountains themselves. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes that some described as knowing, and others, less charitably, as dead. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. What Ezekiel said was law in that hollow. His word was never questioned. His decisions were never challenged. Ezekiel had 5 children who had survived to adulthood, 3 sons and 2 daughters. The eldest son, Josiah, was 49, built like his father but heavier, with massive hands scarred from a lifetime of labor. He had married a woman from a neighboring hollow, Arlene, who had borne him 4 children before dying of pneumonia in 1943. Josiah rarely showed emotion, and his children, 3 boys and a girl, moved around him with careful, practiced silence. The second son, Malachi, was 45, smaller than his brother, but with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. He had never married. He lived in one of the smaller cabins near the main house, and worked the family's small tobacco patch with methodical, almost obsessive precision. Locals who occasionally encountered him on the rare trips to town reported that he watched people with an unblinking stare that made them want to leave his presence as quickly as possible. The third son, Nathaniel, was 41. He was different from his brothers, quicker to smile, more likely to engage in brief conversation. He had married outside the immediate area, bringing home a woman named Caroline from a town 30 miles away. This alone marked him as rebellious. Caroline was educated, having attended school through the 8th grade, and she brought with her ideas about proper child rearing and Christian values that sometimes clashed with the Greer family traditions. She had given Nathaniel 3 children, and she insisted they be baptized in a proper church, not by Ezekiel in the creek behind the house as family custom dictated. The 2 daughters rarely entered the historical record. The eldest, Ruth, had married and moved away in 1925, and contact with her had gradually ceased. The youngest, Lee, had died in childbirth in 1932. Her infant had survived, raised by the family, a quiet girl named Sarah, who by 1947 was 15 years old and, according to later testimony, terrified of something she could never quite articulate. The homestead itself was largely self-sufficient. They grew corn, beans, and squash in small, cleared patches. They kept chickens, pigs, and a few cattle. They hunted deer and wild turkey in the surrounding forest. They gathered ginseng, yellowroot, and other herbs to trade for the few necessities they couldn't produce themselves. And they kept to themselves, discouraging visitors with cold silence and unwelcoming stares. But there were things about the Greer homestead that troubled the few people who knew it. The stone building at the back of the property, for instance. It had been there as long as anyone could remember, built from fitted stones without mortar. its single-door heavy timber reinforced with iron. There were no windows. Smoke sometimes rose from a hole in its roof, even in summer. And the sound that occasionally emanated from it, a low, rhythmic sound that could have been chanting or could have been something else entirely, made people who heard it from the trail below quicken their pace. There was also the matter of the census. Every decade, census takers were supposed to visit every household in America, recording names, ages, and relationships. But the census records for the Greer household were inconsistent in troubling ways. The 1920 census listed 12 people living in the hollow. The 1930 census listed 9. But the 1940 census, when it was finally taken by a brave or foolhardy official who made the trek up that treacherous trail, listed 14. Where had those additional people come from? Who were they? When asked, Ezekiel had provided names: extended family, cousins, distant relations, but he had been vague about details, and the census taker, unnerved by the atmosphere and eager to leave, had not pressed for clarification. There were also the rumors, dark whispers that surfaced every few years and then faded again, dismissed as mountain superstition or malicious gossip. People spoke of lights seen in the hollow late at night, moving in patterns that suggested ritual rather than practicality. They spoke of sounds, the screaming that could have been wildcats but seemed too regular, too rhythmic. They spoke of people who had gone to trade with the Greers and never returned, previous, though no one could aim these families all with certainty. And there was the fact that the Greer family seemed wrong somehow. Observers couldn't quite articulate it, but something about the way they moved, the way they interacted, suggested relationships that weren't quite natural. The children were too silent, too obedient. The adults watched each other with a wariness that seemed inappropriate for family. And young Sarah, on the rare occasions she was glimpsed, had eyes that seemed to contain too much knowledge, too much fear, for a 15-year-old girl. But these were mountains where people minded their own business, where asking too many questions was considered rude at best and dangerous at worst, where families had settled disputes with bullets and silence for generations. And so the Greers were left alone, their secrets undisturbed, their traditions unquestioned, until the spring of 1947, when Caroline Greer walked 15 miles through mountain wilderness to reach the sheriff's office in Harlan, and what she told Deputy Sheriff if James Pritchard would set in motion an investigation that would horrify a nation and reveal an evil so profound that even decades later, people who knew the details would struggle to speak of them. Caroline Greer arrived at the sheriff's office on April 17, 1947, just after dawn. She was disheveled, exhausted, her dress torn in several places from fighting through laurel thickets. Her hands were scratched and bleeding. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something between terror and relief. Deputy Pritchard, a 32-year-old veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater and thought he had seen humanity at its worst, would later say that nothing in his combat experience had prepared him for the story Caroline told that morning. She spoke in a rush at first, words tumbling over each other, then forced herself to slow down, to be coherent. She explained that she had left the hollow in the middle of the night, climbing out a window while her husband slept, and had walked through darkness guided only by moonlight and desperate determination. She explained that she had wanted to leave for years, but had been watched too closely, controlled too completely. She explained that she had finally found her chance and taken it, knowing she could never return. And then she explained why. "They keep people," she said, her voice shaking, "in the stone house. They keep them there." Pritchard leaned forward. "Keep people? What do you mean?" "Prisoners," Caroline whispered. "Family, but also others. People they've taken over the years. They keep them in the stone house, and they use them for. She struggled for words, for the tradition, the old ways, the family religion. The deputy's hand had moved instinctively toward his service revolver. "Mrs. Greer, are you telling me there are people being held against their will on your property?" "Yes." The word came out as a sob. "And worse, so much worse, the things they do to them, the rituals, it's been happening for generations. Ezekiel's father did it before him, and his father before that. It goes back to the old country, Nathaniel told me once. To Scotland, to the old clan ways, but it got twisted over here, mixed with other things, Cherokee things, and things that aren't from anywhere Christian." Pritchard asked her to slow down, to start from the beginning. And over the next 3 hours, Caroline Greer provided testimony that would fill 17 pages of handwritten notes. She described the stone building in detail. It was partially underground, dug into the hillside, with walls 4 feet thick. The interior was divided into cells, crude chambers, separated by wooden barriers. There were chains bolted into the stone walls. There was a central area with what she described as an altar, though she could barely speak of what the altar was used for. She explained that the family kept some of their own members there, relatives who had tried to leave, who had questioned the traditions, who had threatened to tell outsiders what happened in Hollow. These family members were not simply prisoners. They were used in rituals that Caroline struggled to describe, ceremonies conducted by Ezekiel that combined bastardized Christianity with practices that seemed to predate any organized religion. But there were also outsiders. Caroline knew of at least 3. A traveling salesman who had come through the hollow in 1944 and never left. A young woman who had been hiking the mountains in 1945 and vanished, and a drifter who had asked for work in early 1946. These people had been taken, imprisoned, and subjected to treatment that Caroline could only hint at, her voice breaking whenever she tried to provide details. "Why?" Pritchard asked, his face pale. "Why would they do this?" "The tradition," Caroline repeated. "Ezekiel teaches that the family's prosperity, its survival, depends on maintaining the old ways, blood sacrifice, ritual purification. He says the land demands it, that the mountains themselves require offerings. He says it's what kept the family alive through famine and war, through all the hard times, and everyone believes him. Even Nathaniel, my Nathaniel. He knows it's wrong, I can see it in his eyes, but he won't stand against his father. No one will." She described the ceremonies she had witnessed, speaking in a monotone that suggested trauma, induced dissociation. Gatherings in the stone house during new moons, chanting in a language she didn't recognize, actions she could barely articulate, and the sounds, the terrible sounds that came from that building on those nights, sounds that haunted her dreams and made her want to flee into the forest and never stop running. "And the children?" Pritchard asked carefully. "Are the children involved?" Caroline's face crumpled. "They're being trained, taught that this is normal, that this is what family does. Josiah's sons are already participating. They're learning from their grandfather. By the time they're grown, they'll believe it completely, and they'll continue it with their own children. It will never stop unless someone stops it." Deputy Pritchard immediately contacted Sheriff Henry Wallace, who was in the county seat. Wallace, a political appointee with limited law enforcement experience but good instincts, recognized the gravity of the situation. By noon, he had assembled a team: Pritchard, 2 other deputies, a state police officer who happened to be in the area, and Dr. Martin Fletcher, the county coroner, who was asked to come in case there were bodies to examine. They also contacted the FBI field office in Knoxville, Tennessee, as the case potentially involved kidnapping across state lines. Agent Robert Kincaid, a methodical investigator with experience in complex rural cases, agreed to meet them at the Greer homestead. But first, Wallace made a decision that probably saved lives. He obtained a warrant. In 1947, Appalachia, law enforcement often operated informally, especially in remote areas. But Wallace understood that whatever they found in that hollow would need to stand up in court, would need to be documented properly, would need to be handled by the book. He woke up Judge Thomas Merritt at home and presented Caroline's testimony. Merritt, shaken by what he read, signed a warrant authorizing search of the Greer property and detention of any individuals found to be held unlawfully. By 4 p.m. that same day, the team, now 7 men strong, began the trek up the narrow trail toward the Greer Hollow. They carried shotguns, sidearms, flashlights, and rope. Dr. Fletcher brought his medical bag and a camera, one of the few in the county. Agent Kincaid, who would arrive the following morning, had instructed them to disturb as little as possible and to document everything. The walk took 90 minutes, climbing steadily through dense forest that seemed to close in behind them. The afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of decaying leaves. No birds sang. The only sounds were their footsteps and their breathing. As they approached the clearing where the Greer homestead stood, Sheriff Wallace called a halt. They could see smoke rising from the main cabin's chimney. Figures moved between buildings, adults going about the business of the farm. Everything looked mundane, ordinary. It was difficult to reconcile Caroline's horrific testimony with this pastoral scene. "Remember," Wallace said quietly to his men, "we're here for evidence of imprisonment and possible murder. We're not here to judge their religion or their lifestyle. We execute the warrant, we investigate the stone building, and we proceed based on what we find. Stay professional, stay calm." They moved forward in a group, weapons visible but not raised. Josiah Greer saw them first and froze, a bucket of water suspended in his hands. His eyes went immediately to the weapons, then scanned the group, calculating odds. He set the bucket down slowly. Ezekiel emerged from the main cabin, and his appearance sent an involuntary shudder through several of the officers. He was even taller than descriptions had suggested, his posture unnaturally straight for a man of 73. His eyes fixed on Sheriff Wallace with an intensity that made the sheriff want to look away. "Ezekiel Greer." Wallace's voice was steady, official. "I'm Sheriff Henry Wallace of Harlan County. I have a warrant to search this property based on testimony alleging unlawful imprisonment. I need you and your family to cooperate fully with this investigation." Ezekiel said nothing. He simply stared, his face expressionless. Other family members had begun to emerge from various buildings. Malachi from the tobacco barn, his hands stained green. Nathaniel from the smokehouse, his face going white when he saw the officers. The children from inside the main cabin, clustering in the doorway with wide, frightened eyes. The stone building, Wallace said, gesturing toward the structure barely visible through the trees. "I need access to it immediately. That's family business." Ezekiel finally spoke, his voice like gravel sliding down a mountainside. "You got no right." Wallace held up the warrant. "I have every right, Mr. Greer. This can go easy or it can go hard, but that building is going to be searched today. Your choice is whether anyone gets hurt in the process." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other in silence. The deputies had quietly fanned out, creating overlapping fields of fire. Dr. Fletcher had moved slightly behind Wallace, his face pale. The Greer men had positioned themselves between the officers and the stone building, their body language radiating threat despite holding no visible weapons. It was Nathaniel who broke the standoff. "Father," He said quietly, "They have the law with them. We have to comply." Ezekiel turned his dead eyes on his youngest son. The look he gave him was so filled with venom that Nathaniel physically flinched. "Betrayer," the old man hissed. "Your woman has destroyed this family." "No, sir," Wallace interjected firmly. "Your woman saved lives. Now step aside." What happened next happened quickly. Malachi made a sudden movement toward the main cabin, presumably toward weapons stored inside. Deputy Pritchard, his military training taking over, had his shotgun leveled before Malachi completed 2 steps. "Don't," Pritchard said, his voice cold. "Don't make me do it." Malachi froze. Ezekiel, seeing the situation crystallizing against him, made a decision. "You'll find nothing that concerns you," he said with frightening confidence. "Nothing that a court will care about. We are a family engaged in our own private religious practices, protected by the Constitution. What we do on our land is our business. Let's find out." Wallace replied, nodding to his men. 3 deputies moved toward the stone building, weapons ready. As they approached, they could smell something. A combination of smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something organic and wrong that made them want to cover their faces. The door was secured with a heavy wooden beam dropped into iron brackets. It took 2 men to lift it. When the door swung open, the smell that emerged made Deputy Pritchard turn and vomit into the bushes. Dr. Fletcher, who had dealt with bodies in various states of decomposition, went pale and had to steel himself before approaching. The interior was dark, lit only by the open door and a few small holes in the roof that allowed thin shafts of afternoon light to penetrate. As their eyes adjusted, the officers saw movement in the shadows, shapes huddled against walls, the clink of chains. Wallace took out his flashlight, and its beam revealed a scene that would haunt every man present for the rest of their lives. The interior of the stone building was approximately 30 feet by 40 feet, with a ceiling barely 6 feet high, low enough that the deputies had to stoop as they entered. The floor was hard, packed earth, damp and cold. The air was thick, barely breathable, heavy with moisture and the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, and smoke from a small fire burning in a crude stone hearth. But it was the cells that drew the eye, and the people within them. There were 6 separate enclosures, constructed from rough, hewn timber posts sunk into the ground with horizontal planks nailed between them. Each cell was approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, large enough for a person to lie down, but not much more. Heavy chains were bolted into the stone walls, and in the flashlight's beam, the officers could see that 3 of these cells were occupied. In the first cell, a man crouched in the corner, his arms wrapped around his knees. He was filthy, his clothes little more than rags, his hair long and matted. When the flashlight hit him, he didn't react, didn't look up, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the presence of the officers in any way. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Pritchard whispered. In the second cell, a woman sat with her back against the wall. She was in similar condition, filthy, emaciated, her dress torn and stained. But unlike the man, she responded to the light. Her head turned slowly, her eyes focusing with difficulty on the officers. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but only a croaking sound emerged, as though she had forgotten how to form words. The third occupied cell held 2 people, a younger man, and what appeared to be an adolescent boy. They were chained separately, but close enough to reach each other, and they huddled together for warmth or comfort. The boy was crying silently, tears leaving clean tracks through the dirt on his face. "Get them out," Wallace ordered, his voice tight. Get them all out now. But there was more. In the center of the stone building was the altar Caroline had described. It was a flat stone approximately 4 feet square, raised on smaller stones to waist height. Its surface was stained dark, and tools were arranged on a nearby wooden table, knives of various sizes, wooden implements whose purposes the officers couldn't immediately discern, and bowls that appeared to contain dried blood. On the walls were symbols painted in what also appeared to be blood, crude figures that combined Christian crosses with circular patterns and stick figure representations of humans in various positions. Some of the figures appeared to be hanging, others seemed to depict dismemberment. Dr. Fletcher was the first to approach the cells, his medical training overriding his horror. He examined the lock on the first cell, a simple but effective mechanism, and called for tools. One of the deputies retrieved bolt cutters from their emergency gear, and within minutes they had the first cell open. The man inside didn't move. Even when Dr. Fletcher entered the cell and approached him, speaking softly, he remained motionless. Only when the doctor gently touched his shoulder did he react, and then it was with such violence, screaming, thrashing, trying to back further into the corner, that Fletcher had to retreat. Immediately, he's terrified, Fletcher called back to Wallace, "We need to move slowly. We need to show we're not here to hurt them." The woman in the second cell was more responsive. When Deputy Pritchard opened her cell and approached with his hands raised peacefully, she watched him with desperate hope in her eyes. "Help," she managed to whisper, the word barely audible. "Please help. We're here to help," Pritchard assured her, his voice gentle despite the rage building inside him. "You're safe now. We're getting you out of here." He carefully approached and examined her chains. They were locked around her ankles, old iron shackles that had rubbed her skin raw. The keys were presumably with the Greers. Rather than waste time searching, Pritchard used the bolt cutters, working carefully to avoid injuring her further. When the chains fell away, she tried to stand but couldn't. Her legs wouldn't support her weight. Pritchard caught her before she fell and helped her out of the cell, calling for Dr. Fletcher. The process of freeing all the captives took nearly an hour. The man in the first cell finally allowed himself to be helped out, though he continued to shake violently and wouldn't make eye contact. The younger man and boy in the third cell clung to each other even after being freed, terrified to be separated. And hidden in a fourth cell, concealed behind a hanging cloth, they found a fifth victim, an elderly woman so frail and disoriented that Dr. Fletcher initially feared she was already dead. Outside, as the victims were brought into daylight, some carried, some helped to walk. The Greer family watched in silence. Josiah's face was impassive. Malachi looked defiant, but Nathaniel had tears on his face, and when young Sarah saw the victims being helped out, she turned and ran into the forest, sobbing. One of the deputies had been sent running back to town for additional help. They needed ambulances, though getting them up that trail would be impossible. They needed medical supplies. They needed blankets and water. Most urgently, they needed identities for these victims and confirmation that there weren't bodies buried on the property. Agent Kincaid arrived at the homestead just before dark, having made the climb in record time after receiving word by radio. He took one look at the scene, the freed captives being tended to by Dr. Fletcher, the Greer men now in handcuffs, the stone building with its open door, and immediately began organizing the investigation properly. "Nothing else gets touched," he ordered. "I need photographs of everything before anything is moved or altered. I need statements from everyone, and I need to know who these people are." The identifications came gradually over the next several days. The man from the first cell was eventually identified as Walter Hutchins, the traveling salesman who had disappeared in 1944. He had been held for 3 years. The woman was Rebecca Morrison, a hiker from Ohio who had vanished in August 1945, held for 20 months. The younger man was Thomas Yates, the drifter, held for 14 months. The boy was Thomas's son, Michael, who had been with his father when they were taken. The elderly woman was the most shocking discovery. She was Martha Greer, Ezekiel's sister, who the family had claimed died in 1939. She had not died. She had been imprisoned for 8 years for the crime of threatening to report the family's activities to authorities after witnessing a ritual that had gone too far. Her own brother had chained her in that stone building and left her there for nearly a decade. As night fell on that first day, temporary camps were established in the clearing. The victims were given water, food, and blankets. Dr. Fletcher worked tirelessly to assess their conditions: malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds, psychological trauma so profound he had no framework for treating it. The victims who could speak told fragmented stories of regular ceremonies during new moons, of being subjected to rituals that combined religious ecstasy with systematic torture, of watching others broken down until they lost their minds. Walter Hutchins never spoke another word. His mind had retreated so far inward that no amount of patient care could bring him back. He would spend the rest of his life in a mental institution, staring at walls, occasionally screaming in the night. Rebecca Morrison could speak, but wouldn't for weeks. Eventually, with careful therapy, she told investigators that she had been hiking alone, enjoying the mountains, when she encountered Malachi Greer on a trail. He had seemed friendly, had offered to show her a beautiful waterfall. She had followed him willingly, and when they reached the Greer homestead, she had been grabbed by Josiah and Ezekiel, drugged with something that made her disoriented and compliant, and dragged to the stone building. She had never seen the outside again until the day of rescue. Thomas Yates told a similar story, though his capture had been more violent. He had been looking for work, had asked at the homestead if they needed help with labor. Ezekiel had agreed, had invited him to stay for a meal. The food had been drugged. When Thomas woke, he was chained in the stone building, and his son was chained beside him. Thomas broke down when describing what had been done to them over those 14 months. The ceremonies, the fear, the knowledge that his son was being exposed to horrors no child should witness. Young Michael Yates, only 12 years old, was nearly catatonic. He responded to his father's voice, but no one else's. His eyes held a blankness that Dr. Fletcher found deeply disturbing in a child. He's seen things that have killed something essential in him. Fletcher wrote in his report, "I don't know if he'll ever be whole again." The investigation of the stone building continued for 3 days, with Agent Kincaid and a team of federal investigators documenting everything methodically. They photographed the cells, the chains, the altar, the symbols on the walls. They collected the implements, the knives, the bowls, the wooden tools whose purposes became horrifyingly clear once victims began describing the rituals. They also began excavating the floor of the stone building and the surrounding area. If people had been held here for generations, as Caroline claimed, there might be bodies. The excavation took weeks, but eventually they found them. Buried in shallow graves in the forest behind the stone building were the remains of at least 9 people. Some had been there for decades, nothing remained but bones. Others were more recent. Forensic examination suggested that several had died from trauma consistent with stabbing or beating. Others showed signs of death by starvation or exposure. All had been buried with no markers, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of their humanity. The Greer family, when questioned, invoked their right to silence. Ezekiel said nothing beyond, "I answer to a higher law than yours." Josiah and Malachi similarly refused to cooperate. Only Nathaniel eventually agreed to speak, though his testimony was halting, filled with shame and self-recrimination. He confirmed Caroline's account. The tradition, he explained, went back to the family's origins in Scotland. His great-great-grandfather had brought it to America in the 1780s, a bastardized version of ancient Celtic practices combined with folk Christianity, and, once they settled in the mountains, elements of Cherokee beliefs they had misunderstood and corrupted. It was based on the idea that the land demanded blood sacrifice, that family prosperity required regular offerings, that only through these rituals could the family maintain its strength and unity. "We were taught it from childhood," Nathaniel said, his voice hollow. "It was as natural to us as going to church is to other families. We didn't question it. Father said it had kept the family alive through everything, through wars, famines, economic collapse. He said the family members who died were necessary sacrifices, offerings to ensure the survival of the rest, and we believed him. The rituals, he described, occurred during new moons. The family would gather in the stone building, and Ezekiel would lead ceremonies that combined prayer, chanting in an unknown language, possibly Scots Gaelic corrupted over generations, and acts of violence against the captives. These acts were presented as holy, as necessary purification. The victims were told they were being honored, that their suffering had meaning. Family members who questioned the tradition were warned once. If they persisted, they joined the captives. Martha Greer had made that mistake. So had two of Josiah's cousins in the 1930s. Their remains were among those found in the forest. "Why did you never leave?" Agent Kincaid asked Nathaniel. "Why did you participate in something you knew was wrong?" Nathaniel's answer was simple and chilling. "Because I was afraid, and because I didn't know any other way to live." The trial of Ezekiel, Josiah, and Malachi Greer began in September 1947 in Harlan County Court, but it was immediately transferred to federal court in Lexington due to the interstate nature of the kidnappings and the complexity of the charges. The case drew national attention. Reporters from major newspapers descended on Kentucky, and the courthouse was packed daily with spectators hoping to glimpse the men who had committed such incomprehensible crimes. The prosecution was led by U.S. Attorney General Thomas Whitfield, who had personally requested to handle the case after reading Agent Kincaid's report. The defense was provided by court-appointed attorneys who faced an impossible task, defending men whose guilt was undeniable and whose crimes were so abhorrent that public sentiment demanded the harshest punishment available. The charges were extensive: kidnapping across state lines, a federal crime, false imprisonment, assault, torture, and 9 counts of murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The physical evidence from the stone building, the testimony of survivors, the bodies recovered from the forest, all painted a portrait of systematic brutality spanning decades. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Each day brought new horrors to light. Rebecca Morrison took the stand on the 3rd day, her hands trembling as she recounted her capture and imprisonment. She described the ceremonies in clinical detail, as though speaking of events that had happened to someone else, a psychological defense mechanism that Dr. Fletcher had warned prosecutors about. She told the jury about the chanting, the way Ezekiel would enter what appeared to be a trance state, speaking in tongues while his sons held the victims down. She described implements being used on her body, pain inflicted with methodical precision enough to terrorize, but calculated to avoid causing death. They believed they were doing God's work, she said, her voice barely audible. Ezekiel would pray before each ritual, asking for blessings on his family. He would tell us that our suffering was purifying us, preparing us for a holy purpose, and then he would hurt us in ways I cannot fully describe to this court. When the prosecution asked her to identify her captors, she pointed to each of the 3 defendants without hesitation. Ezekiel stared back at her with those dead eyes, showing no emotion. Josiah looked down at the table. Only Malachi maintained his defiant expression, as though daring her to continue. Thomas Yates testified next, his son Michael seated in the front row with a court-appointed guardian. Thomas described his 14 months of captivity in devastating detail. He told the jury about watching his son being dragged to the altar, about the desperate helplessness of being chained while atrocities were committed. He described Ezekiel explaining to young Michael that he was being initiated into the mysteries, that the pain he experienced was opening doorways in his soul. "I begged them to let my boy go," Thomas said, breaking down on the stand. "I told them they could do whatever they wanted to me, but please, please let my son go." Ezekiel looked at me and said, "The boy is learning what men learn. He will be stronger for it." He was 12 years old, 12, and they destroyed him. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. Several jurors were visibly shaken. Judge Harold Morrison called a recess. Martha Greer's testimony was perhaps the most damaging. Here was a member of the family itself, Ezekiel's own sister, who could describe the tradition from an insider's perspective. She was frail, her 8 years of imprisonment having aged her beyond her actual years, but her mind was sharp and her memory detailed. "It started with my great-grandfather, Duncan Greer," she told the court. "He came from Scotland in 1782, from a clan that practiced old rituals, fertility rites, blood sacrifices to ensure good harvests. But Duncan took it further. He became convinced that the family's survival depended on maintaining these practices in secret. He passed it to his son, who passed it to my father, who passed it to Ezekiel." She described growing up in a household where violence and ritual were normal, where children were taught that outsiders were threats, and that family loyalty superseded all other moral considerations, where anyone who questioned the tradition was punished severely. "I questioned it in 1939. She said, "I told Ezekiel that what we were doing was murder, that it was evil, that I would tell the authorities if it didn't stop. That very night, my own brother put chains on me and locked me in that building. I spent 8 years in darkness, brought out only for the ceremonies, where I was no longer family but another victim. He let me live because killing family was forbidden by the tradition. But life in those conditions was worse than death. The forensic evidence was presented methodically by Agent Kincaid. Photographs of the stone building's interior were shown to the jury. Many had to look away. The implements were displayed, each one labeled and catalogued. Medical reports detailed the injuries found on the survivors, the scars that would never fully heal, the psychological damage that might be permanent. The remains found in the forest were presented through anthropological reports. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, testified about each set of remains. Several showed evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries that occurred at or around the time of death. Cut marks on bones suggested dismemberment. Evidence of binding on wrist and ankle bones indicated the victims had been restrained for extended periods before death. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Chen stated, "these individuals died as a result of prolonged torture and ritual violence. The pattern of injuries is consistent across multiple victims, suggesting systematic rather than random violence." Nathaniel Greer testified for the prosecution, having been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation. His testimony provided the insider perspective prosecutors needed to establish intent and premeditation. He walked the jury through a typical ceremony: the preparation, the chanting, the escalation of violence, the aftermath. He described his father's absolute control over the family, the way Ezekiel used religious language to justify actions that all of them, deep down, knew were wrong. "We were trapped," Nathaniel said, tears streaming down his face. "Not by chains, but by fear and by generations of teaching that told us this was right. I know that's no excuse. I know I'm guilty. I participated. I held people down while terrible things were done to them. I will carry that guilt until the day I die. But I'm here now to tell the truth, to make sure everyone knows exactly what happened in that hollow, so it can never happen again." The defense strategy was necessarily limited. The attorneys couldn't dispute the facts. The evidence was irrefutable. Instead, they attempted to argue diminished capacity based on the defendant's isolated upbringing and indoctrination into a belief system that warped their moral development. They brought in a psychiatrist who testified that the Greer men genuinely believed their actions were religiously justified, that they had been raised in such isolation that they had never developed normal moral reasoning. These men are not insane in the clinical sense, Dr. William Ashford testified, but they were raised in what amounts to a cult, a closed system where ordinary moral guidelines were replaced by a perverted tradition. They are products of generations of isolation and indoctrination. The prosecution countered with their own expert, Dr. Helen Martinez, who argued that the defendants clearly understood their actions were wrong, evidenced by the elaborate secrecy, the threats against family members who wanted to leave, the way they hid evidence and discouraged visitors. These are not men acting on sincere religious beliefs. Dr. Martinez stated firmly, "These are predators who used religious language to justify sadism and control. They knew society would condemn them. That's why they operated in secret. That's why they threatened family members into silence. They understood perfectly well that what they were doing was criminal." The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts: guilty. Judge Morrison sentenced Ezekiel Greer to death by electrocution for his role in orchestrating the murders. Josiah and Malachi each received death sentences as well, the judge stating, "The depravity demonstrated in these crimes exceeds the capacity of this court to adequately punish. You have shown no remorse, no recognition of the humanity of your victims, no understanding that you have committed grave evil. The only appropriate sentence is death." Ezekiel's only response was to quote scripture, his voice cold. "The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence." The irony was lost on him entirely. Appeals were filed immediately, as required by law in death penalty cases. They continued for 2 years, but each appeal was denied. The evidence was too strong, the crimes too heinous, the lack of mitigating circumstances too apparent. On November 3, 1949, Ezekiel Greer was executed at Kentucky State Penitentiary in Edaville. He was 75 years old. He spoke no final words, showed no emotion, and went to his death with the same dead-eyed stare he had maintained throughout his trial. Witnesses reported that even as the current flowed through him, his expression never changed. Josiah was executed 2 weeks later. Unlike his father, he broke at the end, weeping and begging forgiveness in his final moments. Whether this represented genuine repentance or simple fear of death, no one could say. Malachi was executed on December 1, 1949. He remained defiant to the end, declaring that the family tradition would survive, that others would continue what had been started. "You can kill us," he said in his final statement, "but you can't kill what we believe. The old ways will return. His final words sent a chill through everyone present. Nathaniel Greer was never prosecuted, having been granted immunity, but the guilt destroyed him. He divorced Caroline, telling her she deserved better than a man with blood on his hands. He moved to a different state, changed his name, and according to records, took his own life in 1953. His suicide note, obtained years later by researchers, contained only 3 words: "I'm so sorry." The Greer homestead was destroyed by order of the court. In the spring of 1950, work crews traveled up that narrow trail one final time to tear down the buildings and collapse the stone structure that had been the site of so much suffering. The wood was burned, the stones were scattered, and the land was left to return to wilderness. Local authorities tried to suppress the details of the case. The trial transcripts were sealed for decades. Reporters who had covered the trial were encouraged, some say pressured, to minimize their coverage. The reasoning was twofold. First, there was genuine concern about copycat crimes inspired by the Greer family's methods. Second, there was embarrassment that such atrocities could occur in America, in the 20th century, and go undetected for generations. But secrets that dark don't stay buried. Over the years, details leaked out. Researchers gained access to court documents. Survivors, after decades of therapy, began to tell their stories publicly. The Greer case became a subject of academic study. Anthropologists examining how isolated communities can develop and maintain practices that violate fundamental human rights. Psychologists studying the long-term effects of ritualistic abuse. Criminologists analyzing how traditional law enforcement failed to detect ongoing crimes in remote areas. The survivors struggled with varying degrees of success to rebuild their lives. Rebecca Morrison eventually married and had children, though she later told an interviewer that she never felt completely safe again, that part of her was always waiting for someone to drag her back into darkness. She became an advocate for missing persons, working tirelessly to ensure that disappearances in rural areas received adequate investigation. Thomas Yates moved with his son to California, hoping distance would provide healing. Michael received intensive therapy, but never fully recovered. He struggled with depression and PTSD throughout his life, had difficulty forming relationships, and died by suicide in 1973 at the age of 38. His father never recovered from the guilt of not being able to protect him. Walter Hutchins remained institutionalized until his death in 1968. He never regained the ability to speak or care for himself. The damage done to his mind was simply too profound. Martha Greer lived until 1961, dying at 79. She spent her remaining years speaking publicly about her ordeal, warning people about the dangers of isolation and the way traditional practices can be corrupted. "When you cut yourself off from the world," she said in a 1958 interview, "when you convince yourself that your family's way is the only way, when you stop testing your beliefs against external reality, that's when evil can take root and grow." Unchecked, Caroline Greer remarried and lived a quiet life under a different name. She never spoke publicly about her experience beyond her initial testimony, telling a friend years later that she had said everything she needed to say that day in the sheriff's office. Her bravery in coming forward had saved lives, but the cost to her own peace of mind was immeasurable. Young Sarah Greer, Ezekiel's granddaughter, was placed with a foster family in another state. She received therapy and education, and, according to sealed records, managed to build a relatively normal life. She never spoke publicly about her experiences, and her current whereabouts are unknown, a privacy she has every right to maintain. The broader Greer family scattered. Those who bore the name changed it. The hollow where the homestead stood remains empty to this day, marked on no maps, remembered by few. Local hikers occasionally stumble upon the clearing, finding nothing but trees and silence, unaware of the horrors that once transpired there. The case raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant decades later. How could such evil persist for generations without detection? The answer lies in a combination of factors: geographic isolation that made regular oversight impossible, a culture that prioritized family privacy over intervention, law enforcement resources stretched too thin to investigate remote areas, and the Greer family's careful cultivation of self-sufficiency that minimized their contact with outsiders. It also raises questions about the nature of tradition itself. Traditions are not inherently good or bad, they are simply practices passed down through generations. The Greer family's tradition started, perhaps, as something comprehensible: ancient rituals designed to create group cohesion and mark important transitions. But isolated from moderating influences, from outside perspectives, from the checks and balances of community oversight, that tradition metastasized into something monstrous. There's a lesson in this for communities everywhere. Isolation breeds extremism. Secrecy enables abuse. Absolute family loyalty, when taken to extremes, becomes complicity in evil. The Greer case demonstrates that some traditions deserve to die, that not all ancestral practices are worth preserving, that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is break with their family's past and speak truth to power. The mental health implications of the case continue to be studied. The survivors exhibited symptoms that psychiatrists initially struggled to categorize: a combination of PTSD, Stockholm Syndrome, learned helplessness, and spiritual trauma. Their experiences helped shape modern understanding of ritualistic abuse and informed treatment approaches for survivors of cult violence. In Appalachian studies, the Greer case serves as a cautionary tale about romanticizing isolation. While much of mountain culture is worth celebrating and preserving, the music, the crafts, the storytelling traditions, the close-knit communities, researchers acknowledge that isolation also allowed harmful practices to persist. The case helped spark changes in how social services approached remote communities, how law enforcement trained officers to recognize signs of ongoing abuse in family systems, and how courts understood the complexity of crimes committed within isolated cultural contexts. The stone building itself, though destroyed, lives on in nightmares and case studies. Photographs from the investigation are kept in restricted archives, shown only to law enforcement and researchers with legitimate need. Those who have seen them report that no amount of professional distance can prepare you for the visual evidence of such systematic cruelty. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Greer case is how close it came to never being discovered. If Caroline hadn't found the courage to flee that night in April 1947, if she had remained silent out of fear or misguided loyalty, the tradition would have continued. More victims would have been taken. The bodies in the forest would have multiplied. And eventually, Josiah's sons would have inherited their grandfather's role, perpetuating the cycle for another generation. One woman's courage ended a multi-generational pattern of evil. That alone should give us hope, that no matter how entrenched darkness may be, no matter how protected by tradition and fear, truth can still break through if someone is brave enough to speak it. The story of the Greer family remains a disturbing reminder that evil can flourish in the shadows of isolation, that ancestral traditions can become prisons as real as chains and stone walls, and that silence in the face of horror makes us all complicit. But questions remain that haunt researchers and descendants alike. Were there other families in those mountains practicing similar traditions? The Greers spoke of the old ways, as though they were part of a larger system, as though other families knew and understood what they referenced. Did other hollows hide similar secrets? Were there victims who were never found, families whose disappeared members were never investigated? Malachi's final words, his insistence that the old ways will return, echo uncomfortably through the decades. Was he simply defiant in the face of death, or did he know something that investigators never uncovered? Were there Confederates in other communities, people who shared the Greer family's twisted beliefs and who might have continued the practices elsewhere? To this day, hikers in that region of Kentucky occasionally report finding abandoned stone structures deep in the forest, buildings that serve no obvious agricultural purpose, with symbols carved into walls and blackened earth inside. Park rangers dismiss these as old homesteads or root cellars, remnants of a bygone era when people lived more closely with the land. But some researchers wonder if these structures tell a darker story, if the Greers were part of a network rather than an isolated aberration. The hollow where the Greer homestead stood is silent now, reclaimed by forest, marked by no sign or memorial. The trail that once led there has vanished under decades of growth. Local residents discourage hikers from exploring that region, though they rarely explain why. And on certain nights, particularly during the new moon, people living in the valleys below report hearing sounds from the ridge, rhythmic, distant, like chanting carried on the wind. Probably just the wind itself, distorted by the terrain, probably just imagination, primed by knowledge of what once occurred there. Probably. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest secrets has resonated with you, if you find yourself contemplating the thin line between tradition and tyranny, between family loyalty and moral courage, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in the hills and hollows of America that deserve to be examined with honesty and respect for both victims and truth. Leave a like if this account has provoked reflections that extend beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your thoughts on a question that troubles many who study this case. What is our responsibility when we suspect evil is occurring behind closed doors in isolated communities? When does respecting privacy become enabling abuse? Until next time, remember that the most powerful weapon against darkness is the courage to bring it into light. Caroline Greer showed us that one voice can end generations of silence. May we all find such courage when faced with our own difficult truths.